Part 1. The Strange and Obsessive Habits of Royal Adults. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Bedside Chronicles. Tonight, we're drifting back to the quieter, stranger corners of royal history. If you've dimmed the lights, tuck yourself in, and maybe have a cup of something warm nearby. Perfect. You're right where you should be. Because tonight's story isn't about great wars or famous coronations. It's about the smaller, more personal side of power. The strange little rituals and private fixations that filled the endless hours of monarchs who had nothing but time, luxury, and paranoia to spare. You know, the sort of habits that make you quietly wonder, was ruling really worth it? Royal adults. It turns out, were not paragons of composure. They were anxious, compulsive, deeply bored people who tried to impose order on chaos, usually by inventing increasingly bizarre daily routines. And since their every quirk was considered majestic, no one dared to tell them how peculiar they actually were. So let's drift softly through their world, a place of gilded spoons, perfumed gloves, and slightly alarming bedtime rituals. Let's begin, fittingly, with Louis XIV of France, a man who turned obsession into an art form. He wasn't merely the Sun King, he was the gravitational center of his own universe, a universe that revolved entirely around his body, his habits, and his extraordinarily complicated morning routine. Each day at Versailles began with what was known as the levee, or the rising, but this was no ordinary wake-up. It was a choreographed ceremony involving dozens of attendants, each assigned a very specific task: opening the curtains, presenting the royal slippers, adjusting the king's wig, and so on. Even the order in which people entered the room was codified by rank. If you were very lucky, you got to hand the king his shirt. If you were less fortunate, you might just stand there and watch, a royal spectator to an extended dressing session. Louis himself took this with absolute seriousness. He believed that every gesture of his life reflected divine order, and so, naturally, he performed his morning like a slow-moving ballet. He accepted his robe with grace. He allowed himself to be powdered, perfumed, and dressed, all while maintaining a face of serene detachment. The irony, of course, was that beneath all this ceremony, Louis was an astonishingly fussy man. He insisted on changing clothes multiple times a day, depending on which audience or meal was scheduled next. He had separate wigs for morning, afternoon, and evening, and while he appeared calm, he privately kept mental tallies of who had bowed too low, who had bowed too late, and who had the audacity to breathe too close. He also had what can only be described as a fixation with his own digestion. Meals at Versailles were public, elaborate, and, to modern sensibilities, faintly absurd. Louis ate slowly, methodically, and always under observation. Afterward, he often retired to, well, a different sort of throne. The king's bowel movements were public knowledge at court. Doctors discussed them in Latin. Courtiers whispered about them with reverence, because in a world where the king's body symbolized the state, even indigestion was a matter of national concern, and naturally, Louis worried about it constantly. Let's drift from France to Austria, to Empress Elizabeth, known to history as Sisi. She was one of Europe's most beautiful women, at least according to the portraits, though it's worth noting that many of those portraits were painted at her command and retouched to her liking. Sisi was obsessed with maintaining her appearance, but not in a casual, I'd like to stay fit sort of way. No, she transformed personal grooming into a full-time occupation. Her hair, famously long and thick, reportedly reached down to her ankles. It took 3 hours a day to wash, dry, and style during these sessions. Her hairdresser was forbidden from speaking unless spoken to. Every strand that fell during the process was collected and inventoried. The Empress weighed herself daily, often multiple times. She followed strict diets of milk, raw meat juice, and occasionally orange peels soaked in vinegar, which, even for the 19th century, was a bit much. Cece was also a passionate exerciser. She installed gymnastic rings and a balance beam in her palace rooms. She took long, punishing walks in corsets so tight they left her faint. Her beauty regime wasn't so much self-care as self-torment, and all of it came from a need for control in a world that gave her none. Her life at court was suffocatingly rigid. Endless ceremonies, endless scrutiny. So she created her own rituals. Daily weigh-ins, silent hairdressing, long, solitary walks. She turned her body into a system, the only system she could command. Moving north, let's visit Russia, home to Peter the Great, a man whose habits were equal parts impressive and alarming. Peter was obsessed with modernizing his empire, which in practice meant forcing everyone around him to adopt his personal whims. He was fascinated by ships, clocks, dentistry, and, less charmingly, autopsies. Peter liked to practice surgery, not in theory, but literally. He performed tooth extractions on his courtiers, whether they needed it or not. He dissected corpses for fun, believing it made him more enlightened. He even built his own cabinet of curiosities filled with human and animal specimens, which visitors were expected to admire with enthusiasm. He was also fixated on cleanliness, though his standards were somewhat unusual. He enjoyed bathing in freezing rivers and encouraged others to join him. He believed that cold water improved health and spirit, a theory that must have been deeply unpopular in the Russian winter. And yet, for all his grand ambitions, Peter's life was a patchwork of compulsions, a constant need to fix, improve, dissect, and measure everything, including, at times, the people around him. Across the channel, in England, things were no less peculiar. Let's talk about George III, the king forever remembered for his madness, though it's worth noting that he was also one of the most disciplined monarchs in British history. George was a man of habits. He woke at the same hour, prayed at the same desk, ate the same breakfast. He loved farming so much that people called him Farmer George, which he took as a compliment. He read agricultural reports with genuine enthusiasm, personally inspecting his cows and discussing crop rotation as if he were running a small family farm rather than a global empire. His obsession with order was comforting at first, a stable rhythm for a man under pressure, but over time, it became excessive. He repeated phrases, wrote pages of meticulous notes on trivial topics, and grew increasingly agitated when routines were disrupted. During his bouts of illness, he reportedly talked for hours without pause, convinced he was conversing with angels. Even his handwriting reflected his state of mind, at first tidy and elegant, then sprawling and erratic. It's easy to mock these moments from a distance, but they reveal something deeply human. Royal power came with unbearable visibility. Every court became a spectacle, every private moment a subject of gossip. So kings and queens built walls of ritual around themselves, hoping that structure might preserve their sanity. Sometimes it worked. Often, it didn't. Let's drift to another who sought order through ritual. Queen Victoria. Victoria, perhaps more than any other monarch, was a creature of habit. Her life was defined by schedules, traditions, and the overwhelming desire for stability. Even her grief became structured. After Prince Albert's death, she descended into mourning, not briefly, but for the rest of her life. She wore black every day for 40 years. She had Albert's rooms kept exactly as he'd left them, clothes laid out, hot water poured, breakfast trays arranged as if he might return at any moment. She even commissioned portraits of herself with his ghostly image hovering behind her, which, while touching, also suggests a certain degree of persistence. Her servants referred to these habits as Her Majesty's continuing devotion, but privately, they found them eerie. Guests who stayed at Windsor Castle might be startled to see the late prince's shaving kit prepared every morning, or his portrait surrounded by fresh flowers. To Victoria, though, this wasn't odd. It was sacred. Grief, like monarchy, demanded ritual, and she clung to that ritual the way some people cling to prayer. If Victoria found solace in remembrance, her great-great-grandson, King George VI, found it in routine. You might know him as the reluctant king from the King's Speech, the one who stammered his way through a nation's crisis. In private, George was quiet, reserved, and deeply anxious. His daily habits were designed to keep panic at bay. He ironed his own shoelaces. He arranged his pencils by length. He measured the placement of objects on his desk. Every act, however small, became an anchor, a way to hold his world steady against the tides of uncertainty. He smoked constantly, not from vanity, but from tension, and maintained precise logs of his speech therapy exercises. He wasn't eccentric in the grand, flamboyant sense, just profoundly methodical. But in that restraint lies something very royal indeed, the belief that control, even over the smallest thing, could compensate for the chaos of fate. As you can see, the older royals grew, the more peculiar their habits tended to become. Too much power, too little contradiction, endless time. It's a combination that rarely produces well-adjusted adults. But we'll continue this slow, meandering tour in the next part, where we drift further into the strange comforts, compulsions, and quiet rituals that filled royal lives. From mirror gazing to compulsive counting, from whispered prayers to powdered wigs, the royal mind found 1,000 ways to occupy its gilded cage. Because when you're born to rule, you can never simply be ordinary, even in your obsessions. End of part 1. Part 2. The rituals of cleanliness and decay in the royal court. Hey everyone, if you've still got your blanket tucked under your chin, and your tea's gone from warm to that gentle, comforting lukewarm that you never quite bother reheating, perfect. We're right where we left off, deep inside the gilded, faintly perfumed strangeness of royal daily life. Tonight, we're drifting through a subject that might sound simple, cleanliness. But of course, with monarchs, it's never simple, because royal cleanliness wasn't really about being clean in the modern sense. It was about ritual, illusion, and an almost spiritual relationship with hygiene, or the lack thereof. After all, when you're born into divine right, you don't so much wash as consecrate. And for many centuries, that meant the royals were surrounded by fragrant powders, silk towels, and aromatic waters, but not a lot of actual soap. Let's begin where things were at their most fragrant, the French court under Louis XIV once again, because, naturally, Versailles is the logical place to start any story about surface-level purity. Louis believed in appearances above all else. Cleanliness to him was not about removing dirt. It was about projecting grace. So instead of bathing, he bathed in perfume. He was famously reluctant to immerse himself in water, claiming it weakened the body. Instead, he dabbed himself daily with scented cloths, powders, and colognes. Versailles, though magnificent, was a sanitary nightmare. There were hundreds of residents, and almost no plumbing. Chamber pots overflowed. Servants emptied them out of windows. And yet, amid this chaos, everyone reeked of jasmine, rose, and civet. A courtier might faint from the smell of sewage one moment and be revived by the smell of ambergris the next. The Sun King himself had a personal perfumer, an honored position, mind you, whose job was to ensure that Louis smelled divine under all circumstances. He also designed the royal gloves, which were soaked in scent to disguise the odor of human proximity. At any given moment, the king's hands exuded a heady blend of orange blossom, violet, and, inevitably, power. It wasn't that they didn't care about hygiene. They just misunderstood it completely. To the royal mind, filth was invisible if it smelled expensive. Let's drift a little further back to the Tudors, a dynasty that tried very hard to be clean, but was perpetually defeated by physics. Henry V, for example, owned numerous baths, marble tubs, brass fixtures, elaborate contraptions involving heated water poured from above, but he rarely used them. Water, he feared, opened the pores and invited illness. So, instead, he wore layers of linen shirts, changing them several times a day to draw out impurities. He believed that sweat was cleansing, that changing into fresh fabric was as good as a shower. So the great King of England, with his many palaces, essentially practiced a royal version of dry cleaning by absorption. But what Henry lacked in bathing, he made up for in dental enthusiasm. He brushed his teeth rather aggressively with a mixture of crushed charcoal and vinegar. He also used honey for flavor, which, as you can imagine, somewhat defeated the purpose. His daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, continued the family's uneasy relationship with cleanliness. She was fond of baths, actually, and claimed to bathe once a month, whether she needed it or not. She also adored perfumes and elaborate cosmetics. Her face was famously pale, thanks to a mixture of white lead and vinegar, a deadly combination that caused her skin to peel and scar, forcing her to apply even more of it. It was a sort of tragic feedback loop, wrapped in lace. Her teeth, however, were a national scandal by the end of her life. She loved sweets. Her royal banquets overflowed with candied fruit, marzipan, and sugar sculptures. By her later years, her teeth had blackened. Courtiers began to imitate her dental decay, darkening their own teeth with soot to appear fashionable, because of course they did. Now, while England was politely rotting from the mouth up, Russia was cleaning itself in far more dramatic ways. Peter the Great, the same hands-on czar who extracted teeth for fun, believed that hygiene was a sign of civilization. He imported European barbers, tailors, and physicians to modernize his court. He also introduced the concept of regular bathing, which, to many nobles, was a shock. He built bathhouses modeled after Scandinavian saunas and personally demonstrated their use. He would strip down, scrub vigorously, and plunge into icy rivers to invigorate the blood. Those who hesitated were dragged in. For Peter, cleanliness wasn't gentle or perfumed. It was violent, bracing, and unavoidable. It's said that during one of his infamous cleanliness sessions, he shaved a nobleman's beard himself, not out of friendship, but out of reformist zeal. Beards, he declared, were barbaric. He imposed a beard tax to discourage them. Men who refused to comply had to carry a special medal proving they had paid the tax, engraved with the words, "The beard is a useless burden." Peter's approach to hygiene was part reform, part psychological warfare. Unlike most of his policies, it worked, sort of. Russia became more civilized, at least by Western standards, though possibly more traumatized in the process. Let's float now to the Habsburgs, that famously inbred dynasty of Spain and Austria, where hygiene was often as complicated as the family tree. The Spanish Habsburgs in particular cultivated a kind of holy austerity. They associated excessive washing with vanity and sin. Queen Isabella of Castile reportedly bathed only twice in her life, once at birth and once before her wedding. Her descendants inherited both her empire and, tragically, her approach to bathing. Philip II, her son, was deeply pious and chronically ill. He kept relics, saints' bones, and bits of the true cross in his bedroom, but had little faith in soap. He changed shirts frequently, a gesture of both modesty and medical theory, but avoided full immersion. When he died, his attendants noted that his body was so heavily perfumed that the scent lingered in his chambers for weeks, which, frankly, may have been for the best. In Vienna, things were slightly more advanced. The Austrian Habsburgs at least understood the symbolic value of cleanliness, even if not the practical side. They built marble bath halls and ornamental wash basins, more for display than for use. One empress reportedly had a gilded bathtub filled with rose water, which she entered only to sit gracefully and be admired. Actual washing was considered unnecessary. After all, water was for peasants. If the early modern period was defined by perfume denial, the 18th and 19th centuries introduced a new obsession: purity through science. Napoleon Bonaparte, for example, bathed daily, an unheard of level of cleanliness for his time. He spent hours soaking, dictating letters to his secretaries from the tub. He insisted that his baths be exactly body temperature, refilled frequently with fresh hot water. He also had a famous fixation with scent, though his preference leaned toward the strong and musky. He wrote to his mistress, Josephine, "Don't bathe, I'm coming home," a phrase that has haunted historians, and, one assumes, perfumers, ever since. Napoleon's hygiene habits were part of his manic self-discipline. His world was chaos. Bathing was order. He might have lost control of Europe, but at least he could control the temperature of his bathwater. By the time we reached the Victorian era, cleanliness had become a moral crusade. Soap advertisements preached virtue. Cleanliness was next to godliness, or, at the very least, middle-class respectability. But as usual, the royals took it to extremes. Queen Victoria herself was meticulous about cleanliness, though within strict boundaries. She bathed daily, which she considered a civilizing duty, and insisted her children do the same. However, her approach was less about freshness and more about propriety. Her bathwater was always precisely measured and infused with carbolic for disinfection, an idea inspired by the new science of germs. Her son, Edward VII, was less scientific and more indulgent. He adored luxurious baths, often taken with champagne and attended by his valet. He owned custom-made bathing devices that sprayed warm water from multiple angles, the earliest prototypes of the modern shower. And, naturally, he believed all this indulgence was essential to maintaining vital energy, which is probably what everyone says when their tub costs as much as a small cottage. Let's drift now toward the more peculiar edge of royal hygiene, the rituals of unclean cleanliness. Marie Antoinette, for instance, loved to play at being a simple milkmaid in her private retreat at Versailles, the petty Trianon. She would don muslin gowns and wash her hands in porcelain basins shaped like dairy pails, except the milk was actually perfumed almond water. She found the act charming, rustic, and utterly disconnected from reality. It was cleanliness as performance art. In the same century, Catherine the Great of Russia bathed in champagne. At least, that's what her courtiers claimed. It's likely exaggerated, though entirely believable for a woman who built entire rooms out of amber. What's certain is that she maintained strict personal grooming habits and expected the same of her lovers. Hygiene, for her, was an extension of control and seduction, and in a court that revolved around her whims, smelling pleasant was practically a political statement. Not all royal hygiene was so glamorous, though. Some was purely survival. Take poor Charles I of Spain, the last Habsburg king of his line. He was a medical mystery wrapped in superstition. Born deformed and sickly, he was treated with an array of bizarre cleansing rituals, daily holy water applications, bloodletting, and fumigation with burning herbs. Doctors believed his ailments came from impure humors, which could be expelled through the skin, so they rubbed him with strange ointments and forced him to sweat beneath heavy blankets. It didn't help, of course. By the time he died, his body was so frail that the autopsy shocked even the most hardened physicians. They said his heart was the size of a walnut, his lungs blackened, and, in the understated words of one doctor, his intestines rotted. So, yes, the royal quest for purity often ended in decay, and yet, perhaps there's something poetic in that. The royal obsession with cleanliness wasn't really about soap or scent. It was about control, about imposing order on the body when the mind and the world refused to cooperate. From Louis's perfumed gloves to Victoria's disinfected baths, every ritual was a small act of defiance against chaos. And while it's easy to laugh at the powdered wigs, the beard taxes, the UD toilet, these habits reveal something deeply human. Even kings and queens wanted to feel safe inside their own skin. So as we leave this fragrant, faintly absurd era of perfumed palaces and rosewater rituals, take a slow breath. Imagine the hush of Versailles corridors at dawn, the soft clink of porcelain basins, the whisper of silk towels. It was all performance. Cleanliness as ceremony, purity as power, and beneath it all, the faint, lingering truth that no amount of perfume could ever wash away mortality. End of part 2. Part 3. The peculiar diets and eating rituals of monarchs. Hey everyone, if you're still awake, congratulations. If not, well, that's sort of the point. Either way, settle in a little deeper, maybe adjust the pillow, and let's drift into the next chapter of royal absurdity, the curious world of what monarchs ate, how they ate it, and how it all somehow reflected their fragile egos. Because of course, royal eating was never just eating. It was ceremony, politics, religion, and insecurity all served on the same gilded plate. Meals were performances, and digestion, if it happened at all, was a private miracle. Let's begin, as usual, with the French. They did everything with flair, especially when it came to food. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, made dining into a kind of daily opera. He had multiple meals a day, each staged before an audience of courtiers who pretended to be deeply fascinated by the act of him chewing. The Grand Couvert, literally the Great Covering, was a public dinner in which the king and queen ate while the nobility stood and watched. No one at court dared to sit, and no one else ate unless invited to do so by the king. So imagine standing in a crowded, humid hall, watching a heavily powdered monarch slowly consume soup while you tried not to faint from hunger or heat. Truly, civilization at its peak. Louis's dinners were massive. Roasted meats, sauces thick with butter, whole pastries shaped like fortresses. He ate quickly, apparently, shoveling food with a kind of regal efficiency that left observers both impressed and slightly alarmed. Afterward, he would dab his lips with linen, nod faintly, and leave the room, at which point his attendants would descend upon the leftovers like starved wolves. But even in this excess, there were strange rules. The king could not serve himself. Every dish had to pass through a chain of attendants, the officier's debouche, to ensure it wasn't poisoned. One man presented it, another uncovered it, a third held the napkin. By the time the meal reached the king, it had been inspected, blessed, and occasionally cooled to room temperature. Safety before flavor, naturally. While France was dining like a theater performance, England was trying to pretend it wasn't impressed. Let's drift back to Henry V, that most famously appetitive of kings. He was a man of tremendous appetites for food, for power, and for general chaos. His table groaned under the weight of meats: swan, boar, venison, and entire roasted peacocks served with their feathers reattached for decoration. Vegetables were a rarity, usually considered food for peasants. So Henry ate like a man in a permanent state of medieval bulking season. His kitchens at Hampton Court were the largest in Europe, over 200 cooks, butchers, and bakers working constantly. They produced hundreds of dishes each day. Even when Henry was the only one dining, food was opulence, proof of power, and occasionally a substitute for emotional stability, which he had in about the same proportion as his intake of greens. None. He drank heavily, too, though not in the way you might expect. Water wasn't trusted. It was seen as impure, so even children drank ale. Henry's preferred drink was hippocras, a spiced wine that doubled as both a digestive aid and a personality lubricant. He was known to down multiple flagons during banquets, all while issuing proclamations or casually deciding the fate of his courtiers. Imagine being a noble trying to survive dinner, not knowing if the man tearing into roast venison beside you would invite you to dance or execute you tomorrow morning. His daughter, Elizabeth I, had a more delicate approach. She was famously cautious about her diet, though that didn't stop her from enjoying sweets. Her favorite treats included candied violets and sugar-dusted almonds. Sugar, though, was both a status symbol and a health hazard. It was ruinously expensive and catastrophically addictive. By her later years, Elizabeth's teeth had turned black, though courtiers flattered her by claiming it was a mark of regal maturity, because of course they did. Across the channel, the Habsburgs were doing what they did best, turning eating into ritualized misery. In Spain, under the rigid Catholic atmosphere of the court, meal times were solemn, almost penitential. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, was a devout man who viewed gluttony as a sin but also had an appetite the size of his empire. He fasted, feasted, and confessed in nearly the same breath. In his later years, gout became his constant companion, the inevitable result of a diet rich in red meat and fortified wine. He eventually retired to a monastery, where he tried to live simply. But simple, in imperial terms, still meant an army of servants, imported delicacies, and monastic meals featuring exotic game. Even in retreat, power demanded ceremony. His descendant, Charles II of Spain, The famously bewitched, frail monarch barely ate at all. He was fed broths and tonics, prepared by nervous physicians who feared his digestion as much as his health. His diet was almost medicinal: pureed chicken, soft bread, milk infused with herbs. The royal kitchens resembled laboratories, full of whispered prayers and boiling concoctions that never quite helped. He would sit before his golden plates, blink slowly, and sometimes forget to chew. A king in name, but barely a participant in his own life. Let's drift north to the frosted tables of Russia. Catherine the Great's banquets were legendary, not for taste, but for scale. Dozens of courses, fountains of champagne, entire tables sculpted from sugar. Her guests dined for hours, each dish more ornate than the last. And yet, Catherine herself often ate sparingly, preferring light soups and fruit. Her feasts were political theater, meant to display abundance rather than indulge it. Peter the Great, on the other hand, treated eating as a competitive sport. He devoured food with enthusiasm, washing it down with terrifying quantities of vodka. Foreign ambassadors wrote horrified letters describing banquets where Peter would roar with laughter, spill wine on his beard, and personally pour shots for terrified guests. Refusing was unthinkable. Drinking to collapse was considered a sign of loyalty. And yet, beneath the chaos, Peter was oddly pragmatic. He introduced European dining etiquette to Russia: forks, plates, napkins, things that had previously been considered optional. He was a man caught between barbarism and refinement, usually with both elbows in his soup. In France, centuries later, food had evolved from power to art. By the 18th century, cuisine itself became a language of politics and identity. Marie Antoinette famously declared, "Let them eat cake," or at least, someone decided she had. But the truth is, her real dietary habits were surprisingly restrained. She enjoyed delicate pastries and light broths, favoring simplicity over excess. But she was surrounded by food as spectacle. At Versailles, meals were public acts of luxury. Even the Queen's private breakfasts were attended by dozens of people. Servants carried trays of hot chocolate in porcelain cups so fragile that holding one wrong could be a diplomatic incident. The air smelled of butter, roses, and powdered sugar, a fragile blend that perfectly mirrored the world about to crumble outside those golden gates. The irony, of course, is that as the French aristocracy dined on artful souffles and sugar sculptures, the common people couldn't afford bread. By the time the revolution arrived, the contrast between the royal diet and that of the masses was so obscene it practically sparked rebellion by scent alone. If we drift over to Austria for a moment, we'll find another royal oddity: Empress Elizabeth, or Sisi, the 19th century beauty icon. She had a famously obsessive relationship with her diet. Sisi was terrified of gaining weight. She lived on thin broths, raw fruit, and milk, occasionally indulging in one small slice of meat per day. Her waist measured only 19 inches, maintained through tight corseting and near starvation. She kept detailed diaries of her meals, describing each bite with both pride and guilt. Servants whispered that she weighed herself daily, and when traveling, she brought her own scale and portable gym equipment, a bizarre sight in a time when most women didn't even walk alone outdoors. Her obsession with thinness was a kind of royal self-punishment, control disguised as virtue, and in the end, it left her beautiful, brittle, and profoundly lonely. Meanwhile, over in England, the Victorians had developed an entirely new problem: too much etiquette. By the late 1800s, Royal dining was a labyrinth of formality. Queen Victoria herself ate simply and quickly. She was famously impatient with the endless courses and speeches. She would eat at her own brisk pace, and when she finished, the meal was over, regardless of whether anyone else was halfway through their soup. Her son, Edward VII, restored the art of gluttony to its rightful place. He adored fine dining, cigars, and champagne. He was a connoisseur of excess, but a charming one. French chefs adored him. He introduced rich continental dishes to English palates, turning stodgy dinners into elegant affairs. He once hosted a 10-course meal aboard his private train, complete with silver service and a small orchestra, because if you're going to eat too much, you might as well do it to music. Even in the 20th century, royal meals continued to reflect the peculiar anxieties of power. George V, for instance, was painfully conservative. He ate the same meals at the same times every day: simple roast beef, boiled potatoes, and pudding. He considered variety foreign and unnecessary. His reign saw the fall of empires, but his menu never changed. His granddaughter, Queen Elizabeth II, carried forward a slightly more modern, but still regimented routine. Breakfast, cereal from Tupperware, because she preferred to pour it herself. Lunch, light and frugal. Dinner, formal but modest. No garlic, ever banned from royal kitchens because it was considered unfit for public conversation. And naturally, everything served in exactly the same sequence each evening, with multiple forks and a precise rotation of menus. The ritual of food, even today, remains a form of quiet control, a daily affirmation of order in a world that refuses to obey. But perhaps the strangest thing about royal dining is not the extravagance or the etiquette, it's the sheer loneliness of it. For all the pomp, eating at the top was an isolating act. Meals were often public, watched by courtiers or servants who couldn't speak freely. Every bite was observed, every swallow a reminder of one's performance. Louis XIV had hundreds of guests, yet rarely anyone he could call a friend. Elizabeth I dined surrounded by nobles who measured her smiles like omens. Sisi of Austria ate alone, in silence, her attendants forbidden to look at her while she chewed. Even Victoria, with her vast family, often dined in silence after Albert's death, the clink of silverware echoing through her grief. For them, food was rarely nourishment. It was symbolism, theater, and duty. The taste mattered less than the meaning. So as we let the candles gutter out on this long, indulgent feast of history, imagine for a moment the quiet that followed, the halls emptying, the plates cooling, the scent of roast and perfume lingering in the air. Royalty, for all its splendor, always came down to fragile bodies performing strength. They ate to display power, to control perception, to feed illusion, and beneath it all, the silver, the lace, the carefully folded napkins, there was always the same thing: hunger. Hunger for food, yes, but also for comfort, approval, and something resembling love. Because even the grandest monarch, with 10 courses and 1,000 eyes watching, could never quite eat their way out of loneliness. So let's close the banquet hall doors for tonight. Let the gold plates fade, the laughter dissolve, the scent of roasted peacock drift away into sleep. We'll leave them there, kings and queens of appetite, chewing their way through history, one absurd ritual at a time. End of Part 3. Part 4. The royal obsession with death, decay, and immortality. Hey everyone, if you've made it this far, congratulations. You survived 3 parts of royal eccentricity, and tonight we're drifting into something a little darker, though no less absurd. So, pull the blankets closer, let your thoughts slow down, and let's talk about death. Not your death, of course, though if this puts you to sleep, it might feel like a gentle rehearsal. No, tonight we are visiting the royals and their lifelong, occasionally unhinged fascination with mortality, decomposition, and the impossible dream of eternal life. Because for all their crowns and cathedrals, the one thing monarchs could never control was what happened when the music stopped. And oh, how they tried. Let's start with Egypt, the place where royalty and death first became business partners. Pharaohs didn't just die, they launched elaborate real estate projects for eternity. The pyramids, those great stone triangles of divine ego, were essentially high-end tombs, colossal proof that if you built big enough, maybe you could scare death into waiting. Pharaohs spent more time preparing for death than they did ruling. Tutankhamun, barely a teenager, had hundreds of workers fashioning gold masks, perfume jars, and boats for his voyage to the afterlife. Because naturally, you'd need transportation. His tomb was stocked like an ancient supermarket. Food, wine, jewelry, and even little statues of servants who were supposed to wake up and work for him in the next world. It was both tragic and impressive. A child preparing for eternity while still figuring out how to grow facial hair. Of course, all this effort didn't stop things from going a little organic over time. Even the best embalming couldn't beat entropy. The mummies, once divine, became dusty, leathery, and oddly small. Eternal, yes, but not exactly elegant. Still, for centuries afterward, European monarchs would look back at Egypt and think, we could do that, but with more velvet. Fast forward a few millennia to medieval Europe, a time when death was less of a taboo and more of a daily companion. Royal courts were built beside graveyards. Kings and queens prayed to relics containing other people's bones. Skulls decorated chapels, reminding everyone that death was democratic. The only thing that didn't care about your bloodline. But the irony, of course, was that monarchs thought they could outwit it anyway. Take Charles VI of France, known to history as Charles the Mad. He spent much of his reign convinced he was made of glass. He refused to be touched, lest he shatter. He even had special clothing lined with iron rods to protect his delicate, imaginary structure. It wasn't death he feared exactly, it was fragility. But the two are close cousins. He lived surrounded by priests, healers, and mystics, all whispering that he could be cured by faith or by leeches, whichever came first. Meanwhile, his courtiers pretended everything was fine, which is the royal tradition for everything that isn't fine. Let's drift across the channel again, to England, where royal funerals became performance art. The Tudors especially loved dramatic goodbyes. When Henry VI died, his body was sealed in a heavy lead coffin and left to rest for a while before transport. Unfortunately, a while turned out to be too long. During the journey, the coffin began to leak, a grim reminder that even kings obey the laws of nature eventually. Chroniclers politely noted that the odor was grievous. A nearby dog reportedly began licking at the spot, which someone immediately interpreted as divine punishment. Of course, the dog had probably just smelled meat. His daughter, Elizabeth I, had her own anxieties about decay. She surrounded herself with perfumes and flowers, layers of white makeup, and endless fabrics to conceal her aging body. The closer she came to death, The more she tried to pretend she hadn't. Her rooms were kept bright and heavily scented. Mirrors were carefully angled. Courtiers were forbidden to mention the word old. By the end, she slept standing up in a chair, refusing to go to bed, as though lying down might invite the inevitable. When she finally did pass, her attendants found her dressed in full regalia, jewels gleaming under candlelight, still performing, even for death. The French, naturally, took it further. Louis XIV. Yes, him again. Made dying into a form of theater. When he fell ill, he ordered that his decline be conducted with dignity and public grace. Doctors attended, courtiers wept on cue, and the king gave final instructions as though rehearsing a farewell performance. Even on his deathbed, he scolded his successor to avoid excess, which was like being told by a whale to conserve water. After his death, his body underwent le grand découpage, the royal partition. His heart was removed, placed in a separate urn, and sent to a church for eternal safekeeping. His entrails were buried elsewhere. Apparently, divinity worked best when distributed evenly. It became a trend. For centuries, French royals were dismembered for the sake of devotion, like holy puzzles waiting for resurrection. Across Europe, similar rituals unfolded. Monarchs were embalmed, perfumed, encased in gold, and prayed over by trembling priests. The Habsburgs, always a touch eccentric, developed an especially morbid custom. Their hearts were removed and stored in silver urns in Vienna's Augustinian church, a collection now numbering over 50 hearts, neatly lined up like trophies of mortality. Their bodies, meanwhile, went to the imperial crypt beneath the Capuchin church. There, you can still walk among the ornate metal coffins, some shaped like crowns, others like mini palaces. Each one was designed to declare, I may be dead, but I'm still better than you. But perhaps the strangest touch was what came before the burial. Each time a Habsburg monarch died, the court chamberlain performed the ritual of admission. He would knock on the crypt door. A friar inside would ask, who seeks entry? The chamberlain would reply with the monarch's full list of titles: Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary, Defender of the Faith, and so on. The friar would respond, we know him not. The ritual would repeat twice more. Finally, the chamberlain would say, a poor sinner. Only then would the door open. A rare moment of humility, delivered entirely by proxy. While the Habsburgs built cathedrals for their corpses, Russia perfected the art of morbid display. When Peter the Great's wife, Catherine I, died, her embalmed body was displayed in a glass coffin for years, not just for reverence, but for reassurance. The Russians had an uneasy relationship with decay. Even later, with Lenin's body preserved under glass, the tradition continued. Rulers made eternal through science, or at least through frequent chemical touch-ups. Peter himself, ever curious, conducted his own experiments on death. He dissected corpses, studied anatomy, and even attended autopsies of his enemies. He believed understanding the body could help prolong life, though his own eventually failed under the weight of infection and exhaustion. He died trying to save sailors from drowning, a rare noble act, but not before asking that his organs be examined to teach others. It was his final experiment, and his last decree of control. Elsewhere, monarchs sought immortality not through science, but through art. Portraits, monuments, and inscriptions were all forms of defiance, visual promises that the royal face would linger after the flesh gave up. Louis XV's mistresses were painted as goddesses, Henry VE as an unstoppable titan, Catherine the Great as Minerva herself. They were all attempting the same impossible trick to outstare time. Sometimes it worked. We remember the portraits. We forget the gout, the gangrene, the fading eyesight, the trembling hands. History has a kind way of airbrushing its corpses, but for some rulers, death wasn't something to resist. It was something to curate. In 17th century France, Cardinal Richelieu designed his own tomb while still alive, carefully dictating how his face should appear. Serene, wise, not too humble. Marie de Medici ordered that her tomb depict her as eternally youthful, which the sculptor achieved through the time-honored artistic technique of ignoring reality. Even in England, Charles I commissioned Van Dyck to paint him as a martyr before he was even executed, a helpful bit of preemptive branding. When his head eventually did roll, the painting outlasted him, and perhaps that was the point. Of course, not every royal handled the subject gracefully. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette had less control over their exits. Guillotines tend to interrupt funeral planning, but even then, myth stepped in. Their remains were eventually collected, blessed, and reburied with full honors decades later, a reminder that monarchy, unlike its members, never truly dies. In England, Queen Victoria's obsession with death reached almost spiritual intensity. When her beloved Prince Albert died, she plunged the entire empire into mourning. She wore black for 40 years. She kept his rooms untouched, his clothes laid out, his shaving water prepared daily. She even had servants place fresh flowers by his portrait each morning, as though he might stroll in at any moment. Death became her most loyal companion, constant, predictable, oddly comforting. Her children called it Mama's grief. The empire called it devotion. Some monarchs tried to meet death on friendlier terms. Frederick the Great of Prussia asked to be buried beside his dogs, not in the royal crypt. He got his wish. Eventually, for years, his body was moved, hidden, exhumed, and relocated by successive regimes. It wasn't until 1991 that he was finally laid to rest where he wanted, beside his beloved greyhounds, in the garden of Sanssouci Palace. A simple stone, a few paw prints, and at last, some peace. And then there were those who believed they could beat death entirely. Alchemy, elixirs, and strange diets were all tried in earnest. King James I of England drank distilled pearls to strengthen his vitality. Emperor Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire collected astrologers and alchemists in Prague, searching for the philosopher's stone. He never found it, but he did succeed in turning the Habsburg treasury into a room full of jars. The Chinese emperors, too, sought eternal life through questionable chemistry, mercury, gold dust, and exotic herbs. Many of them died poisoned by their own immortality potions. You could say they succeeded in living forever, just not in the way they hoped. So, what did all this striving, embalming, and glorified denial achieve? Not much. Really, no dynasty survived eternity. No potion worked. Even the grandest tombs eventually cracked. The finest portraits faded, but in a strange way, they did achieve something else. They turned mortality into legacy. Every pyramid, every sarcophagus, every marble statue whispered the same message. I was here. I mattered. Remember me. And we do. We remember their excesses, their fears, their desperate little gestures against oblivion. We remember them not for being immortal, but for being so endearingly human in their refusal to die quietly. So tonight, as you drift closer to sleep, Think of them: kings and queens, pharaohs and emperors, lying still in their gold-plated boxes, surrounded by the trinkets they thought would last forever. Candles guttering, marble faces smiling faintly in the dark. Centuries pass, and the dust settles evenly. Power dissolves, perfume fades, and maybe that's the comfort in it all, that even the mighty must rest. Eventually, that every crown ends up the same, an empty circle, waiting for the next dreamer. End of part 4. Part 5. Royal childhoods, spoiled, sickly, and strangely sad. Hey everyone, if you've been listening in order, congratulations. You've now heard about royal doctors, habits, fears, and funerals. And tonight, we're drifting backward in time, into the cradle, because before these monarchs became tyrants, mystics, or decorative corpses, they were babies, tiny, loud, and usually quite ill. Royal childhoods were a curious thing, lavish and miserable at the same time. Silk sheets, golden spoons, and measles. So, let's dim the lights, take a slow breath, and settle in. Tonight's story is one of swaddles, tantrums, and tutors. We're visiting the nurseries of the powerful, where privilege met paranoia, and affection was rationed like wine in Lent. Let's begin, naturally, with the Tudors, because no one did family dysfunction quite like they did. Henry VIII, for all his appetite and authority, was a nervous father. His desperation for a son was legendary, but what he actually did with his children once he had them was another matter entirely. Princess Mary, his first surviving child, was adored at first, the little Pearl of England. But when Henry divorced her mother, Catherine of Aragon, Mary was declared illegitimate. Her titles were stripped, her household dismissed, and she was forced to serve her infant half-sister, Elizabeth. Imagine being 15 and suddenly demoted to babysitter for your father's new wife's baby, and you thought your teenage years were awkward. Elizabeth herself didn't fare much better. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was executed when Elizabeth was 2. After that, she became a political pawn, carefully educated, watched constantly, and treated with suspicion. When she was older, her stepmother's husband tried to flirt with her. Her governess had to physically drag her away from him. It wasn't exactly the Disney version of a princess's childhood. Henry's son, Edward VI, might have seemed luckier, male, legitimate, and heir to the throne, but his life was hardly golden. Raised in near isolation, he was tutored rigorously in Latin, Greek, and theology. He was also kept on a strict diet and made to pray for hours a day. He died at 15 from tuberculosis, leaving behind a kingdom in chaos and an adolescent diary that read more like a homework log. Across the channel, the French royal nurseries were no less peculiar. Louis XIV, for example, grew up surrounded by servants who weren't allowed to touch him directly unless absolutely necessary. His diapers were changed by a noble, his bath supervised by bishops, and his toys were carried on velvet trays. As a child, he learned quickly that even affection was a performance. When his mother, Anne of Austria, finally embraced him, it was usually in front of witnesses, to display maternal virtue rather than tenderness. The boy was told from birth that he was the chosen one, literally nicknamed Dieudonné, meaning God-given, and that sort of title tends to ruin one's perspective before the age of 5. By the time he became king, he viewed the world as a stage, and himself as the only actor who mattered. It was less vanity than conditioning. He'd never known anything else. His great-grandson, Louis XB, had an even more unsettling upbringing. When he was 5, an outbreak of measles swept through the palace. Nearly his entire immediate family died within days. Parents, siblings, and cousins. Louis survived, sitting alone in the vast, echoing halls of Versailles, surrounded by mourning adults whispering prayers and political schemes. He was too young to understand grief, but old enough to feel fear. By adulthood, he developed a lifelong obsession with pleasure and distraction, anything to avoid silence. Let's drift north for a moment, to Russia, where royal childhoods were often more like prison sentences. Peter the Great, for example, spent much of his youth watching his relatives murder each other. When he was 10, his half-sister Sophia staged a coup. Bodies of his loyal supporters were hung outside his window. He developed a lifelong fascination and terror of death. Later in life, he forced himself to attend autopsies, dissecting corpses to prove that he'd mastered the thing that haunted him. A strange way to heal childhood trauma, but an effective one. Apparently, his grandson, Peter III, didn't do much better. He grew up in Germany, neglected and ridiculed by his guardians. He was obsessed with toy soldiers and spoke poor Russian. When he finally became emperor, he treated his ministers like playthings, reorganizing armies as if they were made of tin. His wife, Catherine the Great, eventually had him overthrown. You could say he never really left the nursery. He just expanded it into a country. England, meanwhile, had its own collection of sad little heirs. George III, yes, the one who later went mad, was raised under suffocating supervision. His mother, Princess Augusta, believed affection weakened royal character, so George was drilled in posture, obedience, and silence. He learned to bow before speaking and to apologize for sneezing. He grew into a man of strict morals and nervous habits. He collected clocks and talked to trees. By the time his mental illness appeared, the court was already accustomed to pretending everything was fine. The most British of traditions. His son, George IV, reacted by doing the opposite. Raised in equal repression, he turned to luxury, gambling, and scandal. He once ordered 10,000 bottles of wine for a single banquet. He also grew so obese that his servants had to lift him with a pulley system. You might say the pendulum swung from duty to indulgence, both rooted in a childhood where love was conditional and guilt was permanent. But perhaps no royal childhood was more bizarre than that of Spain's Charles II, known, with tragic accuracy, as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. He was the last Habsburg of Spain, and the living embodiment of too much family togetherness. Generations of inbreeding had left him frail, epileptic, and nearly toothless. His tongue was so large he could barely speak, and he didn't walk until age 8. His mother treated him as both sacred and cursed, surrounding him with priests, relics, and superstitious rituals. Doctors blamed witches. Priests blamed sin. No one blamed genetics. That would have been impolite. Charles was taught little of governance, but much of guilt. He spent his short, bewildered life convinced he was possessed by demons. He died childless at 38, marking the end of his dynasty. A tragic fate, yes, but also an oddly fitting finale for a family that thought holiness could outbreed biology. And yet, not every royal child was neglected. Some were simply overindulged, which is its own kind of misfortune. Take the young Louis XIII of France. He was showered with gifts, attention, and miniature versions of adult luxuries, swords, carriages, even a tiny throne. But when his father was assassinated, the courtiers turned cold. The boy learned that love vanished when power shifted. He grew into a stiff, joyless man, deeply religious, socially awkward, and utterly dependent on his advisors. One of them, Cardinal Richelieu, essentially ruled France in his name. Louis never quite recovered from being both spoiled and powerless at the same time. Over in Austria, young Marie Antoinette's life began as a fairy tale. All music lessons, perfume gowns, and miniature palaces. She was the pampered youngest daughter of Empress Maria Theresa, and she knew it. Her education was light, her manners lighter. When she was married off to the French Dauphin at 14, she was charming but nearly illiterate. Court life in Versailles, with its endless rules and rivalries, devoured her innocence in months. The girl who once danced through Viennese gardens ended up caged by etiquette and expectation. The tragedy of Marie Antoinette didn't start at the guillotine. It started in a childhood where no one told her that crowns are heavy. Royal tutors, of course, were meant to shape these children, but they often caused more confusion than enlightenment. In Spain, young princes were taught theology before arithmetic. In England, they were schooled in Latin before they could properly write English. By adulthood, many could recite Roman law but couldn't handle small talk. The goal wasn't to create well-rounded humans. It was to produce divine figureheads with good posture. One tutor of Louis XVI proudly wrote, "His Majesty knows everything necessary for a king," which was true if you defined necessary as memorizing the genealogy of Charlemagne. Unfortunately, practical skills, like not losing your head, weren't on the syllabus. Sometimes, though, affection crept through the cracks. Queen Victoria, for all her later gloom, was surprisingly affectionate with her children, at least by royal standards. She played with them, read stories, and even hugged them occasionally. But as they grew older, she turned stern, demanding obedience and moral perfection. Her eldest son, Bertie, rebelled with spectacular determination, drinking, gambling, and collecting mistresses. When his father, Prince Albert, died, Victoria blamed Bertie for the stress that killed him. It was an accusation the boy carried for life. Even kings, it turns out, can be crushed by parental guilt. And then there were the invisible children, those born to rule but never meant to be seen. In courts across Europe, sickly heirs were hidden away. Their portraits were retouched to hide deformities. Their names were whispered, not spoken. A limping prince might be described as delicate, a mentally ill princess as retiring. Royal blood was sacred, but not necessarily kind. One heartbreaking example was Princess Alexandra of Bavaria, a 19th century royal who developed a strange belief that, as a child, she had swallowed a glass piano. She moved carefully for the rest of her life, terrified of shattering. Her family treated her illness as eccentricity, something to be managed quietly, with polite smiles. She died unmarried, surrounded by lace and porcelain. You could almost call it poetic, if it weren't so lonely. So what do we make of these royal childhoods? Gilded, suffocating, tragic, absurd? Maybe it's this. Being born royal meant being born into a story already written. You were cast before you could speak. Every toy, every lesson, every prayer was preparation for a role: king, queen, consort, or sacrifice. And when you think about it, that's a kind of imprisonment, a soft, perfumed, exquisitely furnished cage. Some of them tried to break free. Elizabeth, I through intellect, Peter the Great through rebellion, Marie Antoinette through charm, but most never escaped the walls built for them before birth. They were children taught to rule empires, but rarely taught how to be human. So, as you drift into sleep tonight, imagine those royal nurseries, quiet now, empty, the lace curtains still, the toys gathering dust. Imagine the small ghosts of princes and princesses who grew up too soon or not at all. Their crowns were waiting before they could walk, their destinies written in bloodlines and prayers. And perhaps that's the most haunting truth of all, that for every mighty ruler we remember, there was once a frightened child, clutching a golden rattle, wondering why no one ever just held them. Good night.